Most kings earned their titles from achievements. Alexander became the Great through conquest. Louis XIV became the Sun King through absolute power. But Ivan IV of Russia is remembered with a very different name, Ivan the Terrible. And when history gives you a nickname like the Terrible, you know you've left behind something darker than castles and coronations. Ivan's story is one of brilliance and brutality, faith and fear, power and paranoia. He was the first man to call himself Tsar of all Russia, a ruler who expanded his lands and centralized power like never before. Yet he is also remembered as a tyrant whose violence scarred his people and whose rage destroyed even his own family. He is, quite literally, the king who killed his own son. To understand Ivan, we need to start with his childhood, one of the most miserable childhoods any royal ever endured. Born in 1530, Ivan was only 3 years old when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent, but when Ivan was just 8, she too died, many suspected by poison. With both parents gone, young Ivan became a pawn in the hands of rival noble families, the Boyars, who effectively ran the state. This was no fairy tale regency. Ivan grew up in the Kremlin, surrounded not by love, but by neglect and cruelty. He would later recall being left hungry, abused, and forced to watch the Boyars humiliate each other in vicious power struggles. Imagine a child, heir to a throne, wandering palaces barefoot, ignored by servants, mocked by the very nobles who were supposed to protect him. It was a childhood that bred not trust, but suspicion and hatred. By the time Ivan was a teenager, he was already lashing out. There are accounts of him throwing animals off the Kremlin walls for amusement, an early sign of the cruelty that would mark his reign. But in 1547, at just 17, Ivan did something unprecedented. He had himself crowned as Tsar of all Russia. Previous rulers had been grand princes. Ivan wanted a title that linked him directly to the Caesars of Rome and the Orthodox rulers of Byzantium. It was more than ceremony. It was a declaration. Russia was now an empire, and Ivan was its absolute ruler. At first, Ivan showed promise. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman who seemed to calm his darker impulses. With her by his side, he implemented reforms. He created a standing army, introduced a new legal code, and convened a kind of proto-parliament called the Zemsky Sobor. For a moment, it looked like Ivan might become Ivan the Great rather than Ivan the Terrible. But fate, and Ivan's temper, had other plans. In 1560, Anastasia died, possibly poisoned. Ivan was devastated, and grief twisted into paranoia. He convinced himself that the Boyars had murdered his beloved wife. From that moment, Ivan's reign descended into terror. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state with its own territory, army, and laws. His black-clad secret police, the Oprichniki, rode through Russia with dogs' heads and brooms tied to their saddles, symbols of their duty to sniff out treason and sweep away enemies. In practice, this meant mass executions, torture, and the sacking of entire towns. Novgorod, a once thriving city accused of plotting treason, was ravaged in 1570. Thousands were slaughtered, drowned in icy rivers, burned alive. Ivan's terror left scars not just on the land, but on the Russian psyche. And yet, Ivan was not simply a mad butcher. He was also a visionary who expanded Russia's borders dramatically. He waged war against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing vast territories under Moscow's control. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 was so celebrated that Ivan commissioned St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, with its colorful onion domes that still define the city's skyline. Legend says Ivan had the architects blinded, so they could never build anything so beautiful again. The story may be apocryphal, but it fits the man. Creative glory wrapped in cruelty. But Ivan's wars also drained Russia. His attempts to push west against Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden ended in costly failures. His treasury ran dry, his people starved, and the terror at home grew worse as his paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his generals, not even his family. Which brings us to the moment that forever defined his legacy. It was November 1581. Ivan, by now in his 50s, was furious with his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Accounts differ, but the story goes that the young Tsarevich had intervened to defend his pregnant wife from Ivan's rage. The Tsar, in a fit of anger, struck his son with his staff, a blow so hard it killed him. The image is chilling, the mighty Tsar cradling his dying son, realizing in horror what he had done. A famous painting by Ilya Repin, centuries later, captures Ivan's wide, haunted eyes, clutching the lifeless body of his heir. Whether the details are exactly true or exaggerated by later chroniclers, the result was the same. Ivan's violence had destroyed his dynasty. His beloved son, intelligent and capable, was dead. His remaining heir, the feeble-minded Fyodor, would prove incapable of ruling. Ivan had not only terrorized his people, he had doomed his own line. This, then, is why history remembers him as terrible, not just for the wars and the tortures, not just for the Oprichniki or the paranoia, but for the moment when his fury turned inward and shattered his own family. Few rulers embody the tragic paradox of power so completely. A man brilliant enough to build an empire, but broken enough to murder the very son who would inherit it. Ivan died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, collapsing suddenly. Some said he was poisoned, others that his own health had simply failed after years of excess and stress. With him died the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries. A time of troubles followed, with famine, foreign invasion, and dynastic chaos, until a new dynasty, the Romanovs, rose to power. And yet, for all the blood and brutality, Ivan left a lasting mark. He expanded Russia, centralized the state, and created institutions that endured. He was a tyrant, but also a state builder. He was a visionary, but also a destroyer. His legacy is not easily reduced to villainy alone, but in the end, one image overshadows all others. The Tsar who killed his own son, a father undone by his own terrible rage. If Ivan's reign were a theater performance, Act 1 was about a traumatized boy who seized power and reformed a kingdom. Act 2, which we've entered, is the descent into paranoia, violence, and spectacle so grotesque it's hard to tell whether we're watching a tragedy, a horror story, or dark political satire. Let's step inside Ivan's court. Imagine the Kremlin not as a majestic palace of wisdom, but as a stage for constant suspicion. Ivan would surround himself with priests, astrologers, and sycophants, then suddenly turn on them, accusing them of treason or sorcery. He loved dramatic public displays. One day elevating a noble to high office, the next day torturing that same noble to death. Think of it as medieval reality TV. One moment you're in, the next you're dead. His most notorious creation was the Oprichnina. This wasn't just a policy, it was a whole alternate state. Ivan carved Russia into two zones, the regular state and his personal domain. In his domain, the Oprichniki ruled, black-robed riders, part secret police, part death squad, part cult. They were fanatically loyal to Ivan, and their job was simple: terrorize anyone who might oppose him. They raided, tortured, executed, and confiscated lands from nobles accused of disloyalty, often with no real evidence. And they did it in style. The Oprichniki wore black, rode black horses, and carried dog heads on their saddles to symbolize sniffing out treason. Tust. Brooms tied to their stirrups represented sweeping away the enemies of the Tsar. Imagine being a peasant, hearing the thunder of hooves, looking up to see a pack of horsemen dressed like grim reapers carrying severed dog heads. That wasn't just intimidation. It was psychological warfare. The paranoia behind all this had roots. Ivan genuinely believed conspiracies surrounded him. And to be fair, Russia in the 16th century was not exactly free of plots. But his reaction was disproportionate, to put it mildly. When the city of Novgorod was suspected of disloyalty, Ivan ordered a massacre in 1570. Thousands were killed, drowned in the freezing Volkhov River, or burned alive in their homes. The once prosperous city never fully recovered. But here's the strange thing. Ivan could be both cruel and cultured. He was deeply religious, obsessed with orthodox rituals. He wrote letters filled with theological arguments, quoting scripture as easily as he ordered executions. He built churches, most famously commissioning St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Its candy-colored domes today are the postcard image of Russia. So we're left with this paradox. A man who could meditate on the mysteries of faith in the morning and oversee a mass execution in the afternoon. Foreign ambassadors who visited his court reported both fascination and fear. They described Ivan as intelligent, eloquent, but unpredictable. His eyes wild, his temper uncontrollable. One moment he was generous, offering lavish gifts. The next, he was flying into rages so violent they left courtiers trembling. His reputation spread across Europe. Russia's Tsar was brilliant but terrifying, both a modernizer and a madman. And then there were the personal quirks. Ivan was known for bouts of extreme piety, fasting and praying for hours. But he was equally known for indulgence. Heavy drinking, lewd jokes, and cruelty disguised as entertainment. He once forced nobles to dress as monks and nuns and perform a mock monastery ceremony, all while he laughed. On other occasions, he invited guests to feasts, only to have them arrested or executed afterward. Dinner with Ivan was a gamble where the main course might be your life. All of this built toward the ultimate tragedy, the killing of his own son. We've already seen how it happened. A fit of rage, a blow, a life lost. But let's linger on the aftermath. That single act broke something inside Ivan. Even for a man accustomed to violence, murdering his heir was different. Some sources say he wept uncontrollably, clutching his son's body, begging for forgiveness. Repin's 19th century painting captures that moment of horror, the Tsar's eyes wide with guilt and grief, blood on his hands, literally and figuratively. The consequences were devastating. His son Ivan Ivanovich had been strong, competent, and capable of ruling. With him gone, the only surviving heir was Fyodor, weak-minded and unfit to govern. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, Russia was left leaderless. Within years, the country plunged into the time of troubles, famine, foreign invasion, civil war. In other words, Ivan's temper tantrum didn't just kill his son, it nearly killed his country. And yet history is never one-dimensional. Ivan also left behind an expanded Russia. Under his rule, the Tsardom absorbed Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberian territories, pushing the frontier deep into Asia. He created a more centralized administration, laying the groundwork for the Russian autocracy that would dominate for centuries. His reign was catastrophic in many ways, but it was also foundational. He was both destroyer and builder, tyrant and state-maker. So how do we judge Ivan? If you look at him through the eyes of his subjects, especially those drowned in Novgorod or strangled by Oprichnina, he was a monster. If you look at him through the lens of statecraft, he was a visionary who turned Russia from a loose collection of principalities into a centralized power. And if you look at him as a man, he was a tortured soul, abused as a child, paranoid as an adult, violent to his enemies, and ultimately violent to his own blood. It's tempting to compare him to other rulers of the era. Henry VIII in England, Charles V in Spain, or Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire. But Ivan stands apart. Those rulers pursued grandeur, empire, and dynastic power. Ivan pursued fear. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted terror. He didn't just rule, he dominated. And in the end, the thing he could not dominate was himself. Which brings us back to the name, the Terrible. In Russian, the word Grozny doesn't just mean terrible in the sense of awful, it means formidable, fearsome, awe-inspiring. Ivan's contemporaries may have seen him as both terrible and mighty, a ruler who inspired dread but also respect. But history, with the clarity of hindsight, remembers the blood more than the brilliance. When he collapsed playing chess in 1584, some whispered he had been poisoned. Others believed his own excesses finally caught up with him. Either way, his death left a vacuum. The Rurik dynasty ended. Russia spiraled into chaos, and the legend of Ivan the Terrible grew, a story of how one man's fury could shape a nation, expand an empire, and doom a dynasty all at once. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, Russia should have breathed a sigh of relief. But the truth is, his death only unlocked the chaos he had bottled up. His weak son Fyodor inherited the throne, but Fyodor was hardly a king, more like a figurehead, pious but incapable of real leadership. The actual power slipped to Boris Godunov, one of Ivan's former advisors, and from there, the slide into turmoil began. Historians call it the time of troubles, and the name is almost too polite. Famine, foreign invasion, civil war, impostors claiming to be Ivan's lost son, even a brief Polish occupation of Moscow. Russia teetered on the edge of collapse. And it was all, in some sense, the long shadow of Ivan's paranoia. By killing his capable heir in a fit of rage, Ivan had left Russia leaderless. By destroying the boyar class through the Oprichnina, he had gutted the country's elite. By terrorizing his people, he had hollowed out the stability of the state. Ivan's reign ended, but his chaos lingered. Eventually, stability returned with the rise of the Romanov dynasty in 1613. Ironically, they were related by marriage to Ivan's beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. The dynasty lasted until 1917, when Nicholas II fell to the Bolsheviks. That means every Romanov Tsar, from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great to Nicholas II, carried Ivan's legacy in their veins, and perhaps in their politics. Because here's the crucial thing, Ivan had set a precedent. He had shown that a Tsar could rule absolutely, answerable to no one but God, or perhaps not even God. He had created a model of autocracy enforced by fear. Later rulers would refine it, dress it up in Enlightenment ideals or imperial splendor, but the roots of Russian autocracy lay with Ivan. He was the prototype of the all-powerful Russian ruler, a model that echoed down centuries to Stalin and beyond. In fact, Stalin admired Ivan. During the 20th century, Soviet propaganda rehabilitated Ivan's image. Yes, he was brutal, they said, but his brutality was necessary to centralize the state and defend Russia from enemies. Stalin even commissioned films portraying Ivan as a visionary leader misunderstood by weaklings. It was a convenient mirror for Stalin himself, another ruler who built power through paranoia and purges, who saw terror as a political tool. But Ivan's legacy isn't just political, it's cultural. Folk tales and legends turned him into a larger-than-life figure, part monster, part genius, part holy warrior. The Orthodox Church remembered him as a defender of the faith, even while others cursed his cruelty. Writers from Pushkin to Dostoevsky wrestled with his legacy, seeing in Ivan the eternal Russian struggle between spirituality and violence, faith and fear. And of course, there's the painting. Ilya Repin's 1885 masterpiece, Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan, on 16th of November 1581. The image of the Tsar clutching his dying son has burned itself into Russia's cultural memory. The wide, panic-stricken eyes of Ivan, the trickle of blood, the intimacy of the moment. It's more than history, it's a national trauma on canvas. The painting was even attacked in 2018 by a man with a metal pole who claimed it distorted history. The irony? Attacking a painting of violence because you think it's too violent is the most Russian thing imaginable. Let's not forget the humor either. For centuries, common Russians have made dark jokes about their first Tsar. They nicknamed him Grozny, fearsome, formidable, but also told stories about his rages, his eccentricities, his tendency to dress down nobles by forcing them into humiliating games. In Russian culture, Ivan is both nightmare fuel and comic relief, the archetype of the mad ruler who takes himself so seriously that you can't help but laugh, even through the fear. And yet, when you strip away the folklore, the propaganda, and the drama, you're left with a man whose personal demons became national destiny. His childhood neglect bred paranoia. His grief turned into violence. His rage killed his heir. His obsession with control created a system where fear mattered more than loyalty. That pattern didn't end with Ivan. It echoed across Russian history. Think about it. Russia's later rulers often used fear to maintain power. Peter the Great modernized Russia, but he tortured his own son to death. Catherine the Great expanded the empire, but she crushed rebellion with iron force. Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union, but he did it through gulags and purges. In many ways, Ivan wrote the original script, the blueprint for Russian power as both glory and terror. And this is why Ivan remains so fascinating. He wasn't just a tyrant in isolation. He was the beginning of something larger, the culture of Russian autocracy. He taught his successors that ruling through fear worked, at least for a while. He taught them that the state could survive brutality, even thrive on it. And he taught them that the ruler's personal flaws, paranoia, insecurity, anger, could reshape a nation's destiny. It's also why Ivan the Terrible still resonates today. Modern Russians are divided on him. Some see him as a great state builder, a man who expanded Russia and defended orthodoxy. Others see him as a monster who murdered his people and doomed his dynasty. He's both, of course, which is why he remains such a compelling figure. But let's come back to the most human detail. For all the politics, the wars, the churches, and the propaganda, what people remember most is a father killing his son. It's a moment so intimate, so personal, that it eclipses everything else. It's Shakespearean in its tragedy, Greek in its inevitability, biblical in its violence. It's also absurd in its waste. Imagine building an empire only to destroy your own bloodline with one swing of your staff. That is Ivan in a nutshell, greatness undone by fury. In the end, Ivan the Terrible reminds us that history is not just about policies and battles. It's about people. Flawed, frightened, furious people whose private demons spill out into the public stage. Ivan was a ruler, yes, but he was also a child abandoned, a husband grieving, a father raging. His terrors were personal, and his terrors became national. And in that sense, his story is not just Russian history, it's human history, magnified by power. So, after all the blood, the prayers, the terror, and the tears, what are we left with? Ivan IV, the first man to call himself Tsar of all Russia, the builder of cathedrals and conqueror of khanates, the creator of a centralized autocracy that would last for centuries, is remembered above all for one moment, the killing of his own son. That's the paradox of history. You can reform armies, you can conquer empires, you can build churches that survive for 500 years, but if you murder your heir in a fit of rage, that's what people will remember. One terrible act eclipses a lifetime of rule, and in a way, that's fitting. Because Ivan's reign was not just defined by that moment, it was defined by the fury behind it. He was a man shaped by trauma, orphaned, neglected, mocked by nobles. He grew up with fear as his tutor and paranoia as his companion. As ruler, he never escaped those ghosts. Every betrayal he imagined, every conspiracy he suspected, every rebellion he crushed was really him reliving that childhood powerlessness. He responded not with mercy, not with trust, but with violence. And when the cycle reached its climax, it turned inward, into his own family. For Russia, the cost was staggering. The Oprichnina left scars on the land and its people. Novgorod never recovered from its massacre. Nobles were cowed into submission, but at the price of creativity and stability. The church grew closer to the state, but also more compromised. And the people, peasants, soldiers, townsfolk, learned that to live under the Tsar was to live under fear. That lesson would echo through Russian history, a rhythm of autocracy, rebellion, and repression. For the dynasty, the cost was fatal. Ivan destroyed the very son who could have carried his legacy forward. Fyodor inherited the throne, but Fyodor was no ruler. Within a generation, the Rurikid dynasty was gone, replaced by chaos, impostors, and famine. Russia's time of troubles wasn't just a historical accident. It was Ivan's inheritance to his people. And yet, we can't dismiss him as merely a villain. He was, maddeningly, a visionary too. He saw Russia not as a patchwork of principalities, but as a single, centralized state. He imagined it as an empire. equal to Rome or Byzantium, with himself at its head. He expanded the borders, secured orthodoxy, and gave Russia symbols that endure to this day. St. Basil's Cathedral, the very idea of the Tsar as God's anointed. His greatness and his terribleness were inseparable, two sides of the same broken coin. So how should we remember Ivan the Terrible? As a monster? As a reformer? As a paranoid tyrant? As a state builder? The answer is yes, all of the above. He was not simple, and his story cannot be reduced to a single narrative, but his nickname, the Terrible, captures the essence. Not terrible in the sense of bad, but terrible in the sense of awe-inspiring, fearsome, larger than life. Ivan wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature, as destructive as he was creative. His story also teaches us something about power. Power without restraint, without accountability, without trust, is corrosive. It eats away not only at institutions, but at the person who wields it. Ivan's power isolated him, magnified his paranoia, and in the end turned him into his own worst enemy. The staff that struck down his son might as well have struck down his dynasty. That's the cautionary tale. Unchecked authority destroys not only the people, but the ruler himself. And then there's the irony. Ivan was obsessed with control, but he could not control his temper. He wanted to build a dynasty, but he ended it. He wanted to be remembered as a great Tsar, but he is remembered as the terrible one. History has a cruel sense of humor, and Ivan became its punchline. Even today, his shadow lingers. Russian leaders have long wrestled with his legacy. Some, like Stalin, admired him, seeing in his brutality a model for necessary strength. Others fear invoking him, knowing he symbolizes cruelty as much as power. And ordinary Russians? They tell jokes. They whisper legends. They look at Repin's painting and see not just a Tsar, but the embodiment of a nation's fear. So when we think of Ivan the Terrible, maybe we shouldn't just see the tyrant or the father or the murderer. Maybe we should see the warning, the reminder that even the mightiest can be undone by their own rage, the lesson that power without compassion leads only to destruction, the truth that sometimes the greatest threat to a kingdom is not invasion, not rebellion, not poverty, but the demons inside its ruler's heart. And that's why Ivan's story still matters. It's not just about Russia, it's about us, about how fear warps judgment, how trauma fuels violence, how unchecked power breeds disaster. Ivan the Terrible may have lived in the 16th century, but the patterns of his rule echo wherever leaders believe themselves above law, beyond restraint, immune to consequence. So, what do we take away? That one man's temper tantrum can alter the fate of a nation, that a single blow can end a dynasty, that terror can build an empire, but it can never sustain it. And that sometimes the most terrible thing about a ruler is not their enemies, not their wars, not even their massacres, but the damage they do to their own family, and through them, their own legacy.